Alright, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast. BBOR, Black Box Online Radio. Today is Monday, and it's another edition of Occult Mondays. I actually have another episode already out here for Occult Mondays, but today just had two cases, couldn't choose between either one of them, couldn't let it wait, no time like the present, as they say. So today we're going to talk about the 1995 murder of Elyse Pahler, and this comes to us, from the United States, of course, but it's like, the reason I said that is because this is something that ignited a debate over about freedom of speech in the music industry, freedom of speech and expression, like all of these subjects were discussed following her death. And let's get right into the discussions on that. Elyse was murdered on July 22nd, 1995. She was 15 years old, and, this is a very, very grim case. It's like there are three people that were charged with her murders. Jacob DeLashmutt, Joe Fiorella, and Royce Casey. And Royce Casey was, I believe, the one who came forward, and he was the one who presented basically the first confession to the police, and then they learned that Joe Fiorella was actually the ringleader of it all. And this has all been broadcast on the documentary series Killer Kids that is on Netflix. And when I saw that Netflix had done a special about this, I was just like, I have to watch, because this took me back to the 1990s. I followed this case for a while. I mean, only in the news reports that they were putting out, and I was watching them live, and I saw a lengthy discussion about this back in the late 90s on some talk show. I don't even remember which one. It could have been Jenny Jones or Ricky Lake. But it always kind of stayed with me. And I noticed some irregularities in the stories that have changed. But it's like, how does this tie to the occult? Well, we have these three teenage boys who committed not only a murder, but this was also a rape. Like, Elyse was raped post-mortem and multiple times, which is absolutely horrific, but why did these boys do it? They were in a band called The Hatred, and they were trying to get a reward from Satan. And in the Killer Kids docu on Netflix, they talked about how they wanted just success in the music industry. They wanted their band to have a best-selling album. They wanted their record to go gold. But I remember the interview with Elyse's father when he says very clearly that not only did they commit this murder to get success in the music industry, they actually wanted to enter hell itself. They wanted to perform their music in hell, and I'll never forget the words that he said. They wanted to be the biggest band in hell. And, when I was just 9 or 10 years old, maybe 11 or something, and I'm hearing that, and I was like, what? It just stayed with me for the rest of my life. And I listened to other metal bands. I was a fan of Cannibal Corpse, and I also listened to, grindcore as well, and I just was never into Slayer. I mean, if you want to, I just never got into their music. So this is new territory for me. But the Slayer was apparently the influence that got these kids, so involved with the murder. Allegedly. We're going by the alleged story, right? Apparently there were two songs from Slayer that had some sort of content about conducting a ritual and sacrificing a girl to Satan so that they could get this, they could enter hell and get this musical success. Now, the two songs that are in question are called Postmortem and Dead Skin Mask. I looked up the lyrics to these songs. Once again, I wasn't really a Slayer fan, so I just looked up the lyrics and I was reading them, and I really did not see anything like that. It's more just like a very, very loose interpretation, and it's not exactly a direct call to action to try and get people to go out and do this. That is more, as I said, a loose interpretation, but the element is still there. The idea has been expressed. We could say that very loosely and very lightly, mind you. Well, this is just, it ignited that debate. It was just like, what is acceptable for musicians? What is acceptable for creative and expressive types? Like, where do you draw the line? Is there anything that is off limits? Is there anything that should not be put out there? Like, we already have things like warning parental advisory. We've been through Tipper Gore and the PMRC. What is going to be the next thing that's going to happen to not only music, because this isn't only about music. This is about, freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and where does this all go? Those were all of the questions that people were asking, and, it's been discussed as long as I can remember, and we're still having some of the same discussions about that stuff, even to this day, in the 21st century. But we really need to look at how these three boys got to the point of when they wanted to commit this murder. What was really going on? Was this an offering to Satan in exchange for a reward of musical success? Well, I have to say that the docu-Killer Kids really did a good job of presenting kind of the different sides of the story. They talked about this, the occult stuff, but they had this French psychologist in there, and I don't remember his name, but, he spoke in his native language, and they had, like, an English overdub, and he said something very, very profound when he's like, if somebody listens to a song or watches a movie that features something destructive, and then they go out and do it, that's not the result of any song, and that's not the result of any movie. That person has an already existing psychological problem. That's sort of the reason why they committed this crime. And we see this very clearly in the case of this, murder from 1995 with Elyse, because it's like, when you listen to some of the things that had come forward, first we mentioned that Royce Casey confessed, and then later on there was this newspaper article in the Washington Post where Jacob DeLashmutt gave out the information that this had nothing to do with Satan, this had nothing to do with music. This was because Joe Fiorello, who was, I guess, the ringleader of the group, I don't know what else you would call him, just had an obsession with Elyse, and he not only had an obsession with her sexually, but also about murdering her. And that just shows you what the heart and soul of it is all about. It's like, that's kind of the heart of the issue. That's the center of the issue. Maybe that's a better way of phrasing it. Where it's like, there is some sort of, material obsession going on here. And that psychologist, that French psychologist that I mentioned, he's right. And he put that into words better than I ever could, where it's just like, if somebody hears something in a song or sees it in a movie and then goes out and does it, they are dealing with some pre-existing psychological problem. And, Marilyn Manson came under scrutiny after, Columbine. And, he was featured in Michael Moore's film Bowling for Columbine, where he was able to give his side of the story. But his even connection to the kids who pulled the Columbine shooting is arguable. But it's like, it's arguable in terms of how much he actually had an influence on them, period, if at all. But it's almost just like, does music really make people go out and commit these crimes? And, the answer to that is just no. It's like, we live in a culture that really likes to scapegoat things, that really likes to try and use something as movies or music or television or something artistic as a scapegoat, and we want to blame that for all the problems of society. Because we also had a quote, from Jacob DeLashmutt in that Washington Post interview when he said, yes, the music is destructive, but that's not why the murder happened. And there's nothing wrong with saying that. Metal bands talk about destructive things. Horror movies talk about destructive things, but so do novels like, Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. It's like, that's considered a masterpiece, does that not talk about things like grave robbing and stitching together dead body parts and stuff? When somebody reads that book, and do they just immediately go out to the graveyard and start digging up body parts? Well, according to that psychologist we talked about, if they were to do something like that, that's not the result of the book, and you cannot blame the artist. You have to look at the pre-existing psychological problem. And also, another note about problems. We live in the culture that likes to scapegoat things for music and movies and television. We don't really want to address the things that are associated with mental awareness as opposed to mental illness. We don't really like to just have the answer that mental awareness is how do you cope with things like greed? How do you cope with things like anger and lust and frustration, that these things can drive people and push them over the edge? Yes, there might be some pre-existing mental illness, but these problems kind of take the bad situation and they make it worse. What is extremely notable about this terrible, terrible crime is that the individuals who perpetrated it, there's this image that they were conducting this ritual in honor of Satan, but how much did they really believe that? Because you have this confession that does not come from the ringleader, mind you. He doesn't say that he made up this hoax. This is coming from one of the followers who's saying that, it was not about actually going into hell and getting this reward from Satan. You have somebody who is one of the followers saying that. And what does that mean? That means that the leader did not believe that this was actually associated with the occult, and the followers didn't actually believe that this was associated with the occult. No one was believing that this had any real power to connect with Satan, yet why are they talking about it? Well, for starters, once again, we need to sort of find a scapegoat, and we need to blame things like Slayer, but it's just so remarkable that no party in this system, in this little group, actually believed that there was anything at all associated with conducting a satanic ritual. And I don't necessarily know all the details of their conversations. I'm not really aware of the exact words that were exchanged between these boys, but it's like none of them genuinely believed that this was a real satanic ritual. They believed that, there was this one guy who is exerting a terrible influence on the group, and he was getting them to do something very destructive. And let's face it, that's another thing we could really talk about society. Instead of blaming music, we could look at it as poorly behaved people exert an enormous amount of influence. Poorly behaved people sort of pull in the kind of middle ground where it's like someone who is a little bit badly behaved and a little bit well behaved, they get pulled into the destructive side by people like Joseph Fiorella, who was the alleged ringleader of the group. Those are the ones that pull in the other people to the destructive side. So it's like, that's really what it is. It's sort of an issue of manipulation and some people following something that they didn't really believe in. And also, just the sort of mental awareness things, not knowing how to deal with things like greed and lust and how those lead to destruction. That's really what people can kind of address, before they start blaming something like Slayer. And once again, I've looked at the lyrics, and I don't think that this is an absolute immediate call for violence. And it's kind of a fair thing to say that a lot of music associated in metal can be attributed to, or it can be connected to violent things. There's so many bands that do this. The first metal show I ever went to was from a band called Kill. That was just their name, Kill, Kill. And they were awesome. But, it's like, I didn't go out and punch somebody in the face until they were dead because of that, because it's wrong. And that's one of the big things that we just sort of always need to be aware of. People should have this sort of, kind of ingrained sense of morality, and they should get that at a very young age. We're talking maybe as young as 3 years old when people are starting to gain this sense of mental awareness and morality, when they're knowing that things like that are unacceptable and should not be done. And yes, that's something that continues onward until the late 20s, when your sort of awareness of morality finally reaches its kind of ultimate peak, and like when you're when the process is finally completed. But we need to always be aware that people who are in their teen years should have an understanding of right and wrong, and they would know that before and after they listen to a song. So it is not really acceptable to try and blame things like music for this horrible tragedy, and it really is just devastating. And not only is the music not to blame, it sounds, as crazy as this sounds, Satan isn't even to blame. These guys didn't even actually think that this was anything real. They just did it because of someone's lustful behavior and his ability to exert his poor influence on that group. Well, that's all for me now. If you have anything to say at all, please drop a comment below. And until next time.